So if I can introduce myself, so Ya Palingana, my name is Maggie Walter. I'm a Palawa woman from Tasmania, Australia. I'm descendant of Manalagena and Warrawoona from the North East Nations, and I pay my respects to the Tonga people on whose lands I am very, very privileged to be here today. So I'm part of the Mayam Nairi Wingara Australian Indigenous Data Group, and we've been working across with Aotearoa, the United States and Canada, and now Mexico to expand what is becoming a very wide Indigenous data sovereignty global movement. And this session today will actually chart the progress we've made. It's rapidly evolving in the last few years to change the way Indigenous data are done and are done to across the globe.
Maggie and I wanted to just start with getting us all on board in kind of the same spot in terms of what we're talking about when we mean Indigenous data sovereignty. So broadly, we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty as the right of Indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. This is an extremely dense slide, and it has components of longer presentations in it. I've printed out both this slide and the next slide if people are interested in taking it. And then Maggie and I have a couple primers that we've produced about Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance. I urge you to take them as a reference, but also to look at and compare how we talk about it in different contexts. It's an opportunity for learning and expanding and broadening our interpretation of Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance. When we speak about Indigenous data from a more mainstream perspective, Indigenous data sovereignty really is generally conceived as having to do with geographic boundaries and that jurisdiction over the digital information within those geographic boundaries. But when we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty, we're broadening the horizons of data sovereignty. And so we're going outside of those geographic boundaries so that we are talking about Indigenous peoples having the right to information and knowledge that might be outside of their reservation boundaries. And we're talking about data that has to do with both individuals and the collective. So it is data about our resources and our environments, it's our lands that we may live on, but also that we are connected to elsewhere. It is data about us as individuals, so this is kind of those indicators of economic, social, our commercial data, corporate data that might be out there about us, but also data about us as nations and collectives. So it's our traditional and cultural information, our oral histories, our ancestral and clan knowledges, our belongings. Right now there are 3 existing Indigenous data sovereignty networks. They're all currently nation-state based, and they're Indigenous-led communities of practice. And the first one emerged in 2015, is that right, Matt? in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that not long after that, the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network was launched by myself and my colleague Desi Rodriguez-Lombert in the spring of 2016.
And in 2016, I'll go through this with our slide, after a workshop held in Australia that brought together from people across the Kansas countries, mainly, myself, Ray Lovett, John Taylor, Vanessa Lee, and Wayne Bodkin Andrews got together to form the Mayam Nairi Wingara group in Australia to take the work forward.
So the way that we're going to structure these presentations is a representative from each of these groups is going to come up and explain kind of the current workings of those groups in those nation-based or geographics-based areas. And right now, Maggie and I will talk a little bit about our international collaborations and how we've gone forward to kind of gain traction. And so you heard Maggie talk about that meeting that happened in Canberra in 2015. And since then, there's been a lot of progression forward, networking both within nation states, but internationally as well. We were able to leverage the Research Data Alliance, which is an international network of data practitioners and researchers. And what they've allowed us to do through a mechanism they have to form interest groups. So they have interest groups on health data, interest groups on privacy, and so we formed an interest group on international data sovereignty, which has given us a small amount of money for support for this in the US for me as a chair to travel to meetings, but also for us to interact with thought leaders on who are driving policy and practice for data, specifically research data.
And look, it's really timely because this is getting ahead of us faster than we're reacting fast, because data matters, and it's mattering more and more every day. So with the increasing ability of technology to combine data sets, to mine data sets, to do all of these things, that our data is out there and it's being increasingly used in ways that we have less and less and less control over. And unless we can put some sort of handle, so what we're trying to do here is to work at the global scale with the RDA and with the official statistics organisations, at the national scale with our own statistical bodies, but also at the local scale, so informing peak organisations and community organisations so that they know that they don't have to just accept data as data, and that somehow how it is used and who uses it is just set, that somehow it just exists. So to question, because much of the stuff is orthodoxy, and we're really trying to break the orthodoxy about how you do Indigenous data and what it looks like, who owns it and who controls it and who can use it and for what purposes. Because it's a resource, but it's a resource that we rarely ever get to use for our own benefit. And often it is used against us.
At the international level, what we're connecting on for right now to focus on are working on creating draft principles of Indigenous data governance, which I'll talk about a little bit later in our US work. But we're making sure that these are Indigenous-led and defined principles, that they align with Indigenous rights, and that they have functionality and have broad relevance to non-Indigenous stakeholders, because we want non-Indigenous stakeholders and these peak organizations to adopt and implement them. One of the most important functions of this, and we were in a conversation the other day, is to make sure that we are saying how we want things to proceed, not, no, don't do it this way, but this is how things should be done. We are also working to create a repository of existing resources for Indigenous data sovereignty and governance. And so on our site, the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty site, when we launched it, we have some resources there. We have not updated it since 2016, so they're now all dated. But we're working as a collective internationally to look through and see what we have out there in terms of research protocols, data sharing agreements, but also scholarly work, videos. So the video that we're recording today will be put up and freely available, likely hosted on YouTube via our site, so that we can more broadly share. And then also we're developing an engagement strategy, and you heard that in part in Maggie talking of really having meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities, tribes, nations, and then also with other external stakeholders. How do we build and increase capacity for Indigenous peoples and nations to govern their information, but also to influence how others are stewarding data. Next, I'm going to call up Mallory Hudson to talk to us a little bit about their work in Aotearoa.
Oh, come on, yes.
You can come up here.
Okay, cool.
Or there.
Kia ora everyone. Kumara Mitsukumo no Aotearoa. I'm Maui Hudson from the Whakatōria tribe in Aotearoa. With the University of Waikato. Great to see people from this land and all of you that have found your way here this morning. The Māori data, if I go back a little bit, one of the reasons this whole area has come up so quickly and got so much kind of interest is that there's been this really big shift around the amount of data that can be generated and the way that it's being linked and integrated together. And it's being done by, for the most part, nation states, but also large multinational groups. And there's a general unease in communities more broadly about the use of information and how it gets pulled together. I think the stuff in Congress with Facebook and how information was used to influence elections and things like that is a reflection of some of the concerns that people have been having generally. And so the concerns that we were having in Indigenous communities about how information was being used, and two aspects. One, our inability to access the data and use it in our own ways, and then the ability to have a say over how other people were using that information was what drove us to start advocating for something to be done. But it's resonated with a sort of a broader audience, and that's been really useful for us in terms of getting this shift, which has been really quick over the last couple of years. So even though we've been drawing on a lot of ideas and concepts out of things like Indigenous research ethics, cultural intellectual property, sort of treaty rights, they've all sort of found a little bit of a home under this banner. And I think that, they just started talking about it. We said the workshop we had in 2016. And since then, we can go to Wellington, which is our Washington, DC, and around all the government agencies, and people know what it is. So after the workshop in Australia, we were fortunate that there was an exercise in New Zealand to create an infrastructure that linked all the national administrative data sets together. And because that was happening, and because it was happening in the absence of any sort of consultation about how people would feel about their information being used for other purposes. So you get health information, you know it will be used for health purposes, but you're not expecting it to be connected to necessarily education stuff and tax stuff and other sorts of information. So as that data was being linked in new, kind of more innovative ways, it created these concerns. So the government's creating this infrastructure, and it really wanted support from Indigenous communities for it. So it started having these workshops saying, we've got this great new tool, how can we use it to help you? And that way you're not sort of asking questions about some of the deeper issues. Who's controlling, who gets access to it, what are the government protocols in place, and all these other sorts of questions. So we turned up at the meeting and mentioned that we were part of the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, which they'd never heard of, anyone else in the room. And but that's right, it sort of emerged from there, and we ended up with a website, and as soon as you got a website, you actually exist. So we're not a legal entity, but we do have a website. And so 2 weeks ago, we had our sort of latest meeting in the network, and the network is really just a kind of informal group, some academics, some people from community organisations, some people from tribal groups, some people working in government, everyone that's sort of grappling with this issue of Indigenous or Māori rights in relation to how data is controlled and used. So these are the kind of three sort of key activities we've been doing. One of the first ones we were involved with was making sure that we had, I guess, sort of like a political mandate of some sort from tribal groups, and we spent kind of a year having those conversations. After that, or around the same time, the next activity was really socialising the idea amongst government agencies. So we kept talking about it, so that they knew that that was something that they had to engage with. And so the challenge we've got at the moment is that all of the government, sort of like federal, state organisations are talking about it, and they're wanting help to operationalise it. But at the same time, we're really conscious that the community level and the tribal level, they're needing resources to engage with as well. And so you'll see there, that's why there's kind of three areas, the ones we've been focusing on. Is it? Sure. Okay. So these areas are the ones we've been focusing on. But just in terms of influencing the wider data ecosystem, most of the things that we would consider Indigenous data aren't governed by us, and they're not in our control. So when you think about things like OCAD, it doesn't have as much application if we're trying to make it influence information which someone else has. And so what we started trying to do is get involved with these big sort of national initiatives. This is integrated data infrastructure, a government department sort of using data for predictive modelling, social investment agency that's this sort of infrastructure is anonymised data. This would this would connect different types of linked data together, and then these other sort of institutions as well. So we're trying to get involved in the sorts of different frameworks they're putting together and introduce kind of Indigenous or Māori principles into that activity, so it becomes hardwired into the system. So that's the sort of the kind of things we're at. And before I get the other sort of one finger, 1 minute left. The other thing I'm into trying to integrate not just the notion of Indigenous data sovereignty, but some of the principles that people were thinking of into the standards of ethics or how research ethics will operate, but also the code of professional standards and ethics for scientists for the Royal Society. So those are our some of the things we're doing at the moment.
Alrighty, I'm back up here talking about our U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network now. So Desi Rodriguez-Lonebear, who is actually a graduate student at the University of Arizona, working with myself, and a graduate student at the University of Waikato, getting 2 doctoral degrees, and myself launched this network in April of 2016 in response to not only international conversations that we were having, but our experiences in our different discipline and work environments with tribes not having the information they need to govern, and running into situations, as Maui talked about, in terms of both access, but also how to work with others to make sure that they were stewarding Indigenous data under our principles and values. Our network is now about 250 people. It is broadly representative of tribal leaders, Indigenous scholars, allies, people in the U.S. government, people in state governments, so on and so forth. And so primarily we have a group of about maybe 30 of us who work in different both academic disciplines or within tribes, who are out there talking about Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance more broadly. And so some of those are part of our advisory council. Randy Akey from UCLA is here. He's on our advisory council. He's now on loan to the Brookings Institute for a couple of years. And then we have folks like Michelle Sunya, who is sitting here as well, who works in New Mexico and really advocates for Indigenous data sovereignty at the state level. When we launched our network in 2016, there were immediate requests, like not kidding, like 3 or 4 came in immediately for Desi and I to start going out and speaking about Indigenous data sovereignty within the U.S. context, which is why we're glad that we had this backup 30 or so people who are also interested in bringing this into conversations. It was a bit overwhelming, we didn't expect it, but we kind of have figured out how to navigate that system. We also launched a course in January 2017 called Data for Nation Rebuilding, and that is offered through the University of Arizona's Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program and the Native Nations Institute. It is a short course, 1 credit, and we had it again in 2018. This year in 2018, it was comprised completely and entirely of Indigenous peoples, and there were 24 people in the room. Some of them were students, graduate students at the University of Arizona. Others were working for tribes, and then there were tribal leaders as well. And Maggie and I also taught a course at the University of Technology, Sydney, in October 2018. And that one was the launch of the program that hosts our course in Australia. And so it also was the launch of us co-teaching internationally about Indigenous data sovereignty, and this is something that we talk about more and more broadly. I think for me, as somebody who's working within a nation-based area, working internationally has huge opportunity not only to advocate internationally for the adoption of Indigenous data sovereignty principles within scientific entities and international policy, but also to learn how others are utilizing these principles within their different realms. For instance, there's a stronger adoption, in my opinion, in some Australian universities of having governance boards of Indigenous data and having oversight of that by Indigenous people. I know for myself that's more difficult at my institution, and so being able to collaborate and learn how other people are doing that and how to talk about it so you get uptake and support within your institution is important, because that's, as an Indigenous scholar, I find that is one of the most important things that I do, is to be able to make sure that my institution is respecting sovereignty. And we also have started hosting a number of symposiums on Indigenous data sovereignty and data governance. The first one occurred last year actually here in Los Angeles, hosted by Randy Key and myself, where we came up with these draft Indigenous data governance principles you see listed here, which I'll talk about in a minute. But since then, we've attended a number of other symposiums, sometimes hosted by government entities, so the Department of the Interior, other times hosted by the US IDSOV network. And so in the next few months, we'll have one at the National Congress of American Indians, where we'll talk with tribal leaders about these principles and kind of try to work to refine them and add to them or subtract from them. And then we'll also have begin to host some more topical discussions. So we'll have one at the University of Arizona in September that's focused on climate and environmental health and talking about data governance within that realm. And so that's where we're moving at this point. All the while we're working internationally to try to strengthen our relationships, but bring other Indigenous peoples into the conversation. So our Research Data Alliance meeting for next fall will be in Botswana in the fall, November. Yeah. Yep. And we will have hopefully more representation from the Global South there. And then I'm also going to the International Open Data Conference, which will be in Argentina, and looking forward to connecting there as well. So the plan for these governance principles is to make them operationalizable in different contexts. And so we'll have these broad principles that will be keywords. So you see here these inherent sovereignty, intergenerational collective well-being. And so these aren't the final ones, but we'll refine them. So we'll have keywords, then a descriptor sentence, and then we'll be able to have paragraphs that provide context for different stakeholders. So for scientists, we might explain it one way. For international policy, we might explain it a different way. And then the most important part, I think, is to have case studies attached to each of these concepts. In the data world, they call them use cases, and so I have to navigate between that. But it's the same thing. It's using stories to describe how these principles and values are applied in research and policy in our everyday world. And so that's where we're going with these principles, both within the US and then more broadly internationally. And those we'll be working on in Botswana and having a final draft after that meeting for international application and research context. And then we'll probably modify them following through the early part of 2019 for policy contexts as well.
That's amazing. Yeah.
I'm going to hand it off to Maggie now.
Thank you. Yarpling in there again. So the Australian context is, again, we have to modify by where we are in the world. So Australia as yet has no, well, there's a little treaty, not a little treaty. The Noongar people in Perth now have effectively a treaty, and there's work going on in South Australia and Victoria, but largely we are a treaty-free, colonised set of Indigenous peoples. And that makes a real difference to our power and how we can navigate and work with government. So we got together in 2016 after the workshop And one of the first things we did as a small group was we made an appointment to go and see the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which is our large official statistic agency. And on the way there we had a coffee, and a bit like in Maui, we decided we needed to have a name to actually be real. So we came up with the name Mayam Nairi Wingara, which is a combination of a Torres Strait Islander word, a Palawa word, and a Gadigal from the Sydney area word, because we also wanted to get the idea that we're just not the one people, we are multiple peoples, and that was part of the problem of the way Indigenous data are done in Australia. So I love an acronym. So this is just a little chart, it's just sort of the bag of data that we currently have, and the sort of the almost complete opposite of what we actually need. And that's not even getting to the space where we're talking about the big data linkage and the data mining that's going on. So we've got this set of this trope of data, and if you look at your own, draw up your own Indigenous nations and look at statistics around your Indigenous nation, that's what you will find. How sick we are, how poor we are, how unemployed we are, and it's all for data, national government purposes, it's all around deficit, and it's all aggregate. So it doesn't recognise, so it doesn't serve any of our own agenda or needs. So government are now starting to get that idea a little bit in Australia, but because we've been pushing it, but also because of the global connections, we're able to bring other people in. So when we went to see the ABS, it wasn't a very productive meeting. I did find I had a file on me. That was interesting. Because I'd written to the chief statistician the year before when they had the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander survey, and I wrote a very polite letter that said it was anachronistic and it needed to be different. So he never answered me, but they did form a file. So the ABS didn't quite get it. They seem to have the idea that somehow asking the same question repeatedly, the intra-collection continuity, meant that they couldn't add new questions. And our point was, well, a rubbish question asked in 1994, 2000, 2008 and 2016 is still a rubbish question. You've just got 4 lots of rubbish that you can put together. But they are now starting to listen just a little bit. So we've been working quite strongly in the last 2017 to build our profile and to get our message out. So there's been a number of national presentations. So Andrew and Tahu, Andrew came across and we did a presentation to the Melbourne Economic Forum in Canberra. So we had 300 senior politicians in the room. And Tahu and Andrew and Ray up the back there, we had an Indigenous data sovereignty symposium at the University of Melbourne in October. Yep, and we've been writing quite a lot since, so we're just using every avenue we can get. The issue where we are now is we think we need to go out broader to our people organisations and our community groups who are embracing the idea of Indigenous data sovereignty, but the enthusiasm for the concept is running ahead of the understanding of the concept. So we wanted to try and make sure that there is some clear understanding and to stop it being appropriated, because the risk now is it will pop up in policy documents with saying that different parliaments are using Indigenous data sovereignty when they're not. So what we've organised now is a summit. So in June the 20th this year, we've partnered with the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute, which is at the Australian National University in Canberra, to run a one-day summit. And I've got just a little the policy briefing and the questions that we're going to be asking the community people who attend that. So if people want to grab a copy of that, just to sort of try and build some consensus and actually build a collective around Indigenous data sovereignty. Because just 5 of us, it's not enough. We need to widen it out now to include peak organisations and community groups. There's enormous need. We know people are interested. It's bringing people together now and get us all on the same page so that we can advocate and move government and move, of course, increasingly private corporations and provide the services that community themselves need. So that's it for me.
So, first I want to honor the peoples and their ancestors on the land upon which we meet. Myself, I come from Sweden, a country that has had a hard time acknowledging that they have colonized the traditional land of the Sami people. And they continue to have that idea mainly, I would say. And this is where I live, and my university is situated in Sápmi, the traditional area. So this problem of acknowledging what actually has happened, the history of colonization in Sweden, is, I would say, tied to the struggle of indigenous data sovereignty in Sweden and Scandinavia. The section 13 of the Personal Data Act in Sweden prohibits the processing of data that reveals ethnicity or race. And this act has, since its implementation in 1973, impaired discussions in relation to any form of indigenous data. The UN, WHO, and also it's coming out a report from the OECD, we're actually putting IDS as a comment into that, has critiqued this along with the Sami society itself, has critiqued this lack of data that exists. And Sweden is serving as an example of a welfare state that is, we have health equity, equality, epidemiology and population statistics are really advanced. But when it comes to this law that has surrounded discussion of indigenous data has made Sweden being unable to provide anything significant on the health and well-being of the Sami population since the 70s. This circumstance also means that there's little data at the moment produced by the state that Sami people and communities can take ownership of. Mainly indigenous data are produced within academia in research projects and guided by and guarded by ethical protocols at universities and so on and so forth. But things have recently been moving forward, I think, and it's due to increased pressure internationally and within the Sami society on Sweden that has called for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a consultation order for Sami issues, enhancing the Sami Parliament's role and possibility to collect data. This and also an implementation of the Sami Nordic Convention may force the Swedish state to open up for discussions of ownership and the governance of data. And I think the IDS agenda fits very, very good into that, if that would happen. There is also need for ethical protocols concerning any form of research, and there's stuff happening in Norway, our neighboring country, where there's a proposal for an ethical protocol on health and life science research. Just in December, this one came out and has a lot to feed into discussion on indigenous data sovereignty. And also, we're in the early phase, myself and a couple of my colleagues, to do the first health and living conditions study in Sápmi, in Sweden, in the Swedish part of Sápmi. And we do this joined by the Sami-led Sami study in the Arctic University of Norway. We are designing it so that the Sami Parliament, or whoever they appoint, will have a possibility to prioritize the research and the data collected. However, questions of ownership is still not solved in an IDS manner, but the Sami Parliament do not have the possibility to archive or hold the data in that form. That's what they are telling us. So at the moment, we cannot do anything about the ownership, but we hope to get there eventually. So, thank you.
I'm timing myself to just. So very good going. So hi, I'm Jen Walker, and I'm from Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, Canada, Northern Ontario. Well, people from real Northern Ontario would say it's not Northern Ontario. But, it's the southern-most part of Northern Ontario. And my family is from a First Nation in Southern Ontario, Six Nations. And I wanted to talk to you, first I wanted to sort of position myself in relation to Indigenous data sovereignty in Canada, to say that, you know, there's been a lot of movement in Canada. Canadian First Nations have been leaders in thinking about ownership, control, access, and possession of data since the 1990s. And so as sort of an Indigenous academic, my role in that and my responsibility in that is to listen to what communities are saying they want. First Nation communities, there's a huge diversity in First Nations across Canada, so it's quite exciting that First Nations came together with a set of principles that are so meaningful and have been so meaningful, and need to be adapting to different contexts of data and things like that. And so that movement is really important. But also to listen to other Indigenous populations in Canada, the Inuit populations and Métis nations. So I just wanted to frame that because I think, you know, we have sort of, when we say Indigenous in Canada, sometimes it's confusing about what we mean. So we have to sort of be inclusive and mean First Nations, Inuit, and Métis data. So as I mentioned, First Nations have been leaders in establishing OCAP principles, which they, you know, the First Nations Information Governance Center in Canada has trademarked OCAP. And so we really are First Nations driven principles about establishing First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession of data. And like I said, that's happened since the 1990s. Inuit recently put out a national strategy on Inuit research in March and established Inuit access, ownership, and control. So you can see this sort of challenge that Maui sort of raised about possession is sometimes challenging, right? So there are data lots of places about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations, and sometimes it's not about possessing, but about the access, ownership, and control. So it's just perspective. And then Métis nations, there's a lot happening around Métis rights and governance in Canada, and data is part of that. So also in positioning myself, I'll say that I have the most experience in Ontario, one of 10 provinces and 3 territories. So we have in Ontario, at least six of the 10 provinces, there's work happening around First Nations data governance, asserting governance on data, linkage of First Nations data to unlock administrative health data, administrative data of other kinds, that is meaningful. In Ontario, we have sort of, based on an initial literature review and then been using this for quite some time now, for about 2 years, this sort of framework for, a space for Indigenous data governance principles in the center, and those may differ based on which Indigenous groups that want to use data, but that we frame that. It has to be contextualized. Indigenous data governance doesn't happen without context of ethical relationships. And we have formalized data governance agreements where First Nations have come together to say, we want to govern the data that's held about us in the health system. So we have formalized data governance agreements that state how data can be accessed, how they can be used, how they should be interpreted, what engagement looks like, which permissions are necessary. And that we've done that in Ontario with Métis as well, and have a draft sort of agreement with Inuit partners that are really framed around Inuit knowledge principles and this idea of access, ownership, and control. So, now I wish I wasn't timing myself because it's almost time. But I just wanted to say that in conclusion, I guess, that we also recognize that even so we can talk about Indigenous data broadly, and then when it comes down to it, we have many ways that Indigenous peoples and communities can be identified in databases. And so we have to think about all those ways. And one of the ones so sometimes, it's like a tick box, yes, I'm Indigenous, or I'm First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. Sometimes it's actually a registry, so we've done linkage with the Indian register that the federal government holds. But also we have Indigenous identifiers when we think about geography. So if people just say, oh, well, we're just gonna look at these postal codes. And they're like, well, you're kind of trying to get around this, but you're identifying First Nation communities, right? So we have to also think about geographic identifiers and Indigenous specific data sets. So if a health service provider is only providing services to First Nations clients, that's also Indigenous data. Thank you.
Well, I guess that's me. My name is José Figueroa. I'm from Mexico. I'm a professor at this institution called Operationalizing at this Department of Rural Development Studies. I myself, my background as a rural sociologist is working on development projects in Mexico, mainly in these areas, in the southern part of the country, Oaxaca, Guerrero, Chiapas, and the Yucatan Peninsula. And I've been recently invited to be part of this group. Thank you very much. I should say the Nahuatl, which is the language from where I inhabit, Tlaxcalcamati. And what, in my experience, has brought me to work being a rural development, is that in the rural development area, is that most of the Indigenous groups in the country inhabit rural areas. And what I want to show in this map, and sort of to contextualize a bit, because most of the challenges we have to push this topic, which is sort of I've agreed to work on, it needs to be contextualized in this sense, because these are the most marginalized areas of the country. So Indigenous groups, 68 of them we still have in Mexico, with 68 different languages, and they all, as you can see in this map, they all are settled in these marginalized areas, which means the poorest areas of the country are these. Basically the three states, Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. And this means people survive with less than $1 a day. We have a population, the last census in Mexico establishes 110 million Mexicans, from which 10%, a bit less of 10 million, are Indigenous people. And this is established as such because of the language thing. That's the way government used to establish in the census if someone was Indigenous, if he spoke an Indigenous language. In the last census, a question was added in which any individual could say, even if he or she didn't speak a language, he was Indigenous or she was Indigenous, culturally. So that increased a little bit the population of Indigenous people in the country. Anyways, so these are the most marginalized areas. We're talking about 30% of inhabitants that are illiterate. We're talking about some 60% of the population without drainage or running water or like real poor living conditions. So what are the issues regarding Indigenous? That's already nowadays. I started sort of working on, when I was invited, sort of working on getting into what was being said in Mexico about it. Actually, nobody's talking about Indigenous data nowadays in Mexico. Nevertheless, it is implicit in the discussions that are being done nowadays regarding Indigenous groups' rights, which is a big topic. And it's a big topic because it is related to the way the natural resources are being preserved or exploited. So what we have now is that we have several cases in Mexico where mainly mining companies, it's a big Canadian one, and have been trying, they've gotten concessions from the Mexican government, but they've been encountering some struggle and resistance from the indigenous groups. Actually, 2 years ago, this group actually won this sort of struggle with the company because they wanted to mine exactly in the sacred hill. So that's a big problem. And also because most of those natural resources are located in indigenous areas. So what is being now discussed nowadays is this law, this bill promoting the right of indigenous groups to participate in consultation proceedings regarding any project to be developed in their areas. And this participation is to be done previously, freely, and with access to information. Which brings one of the important topics there, because there is a lack of access. I mean, they don't have electricity sometimes. How could they access some other data sources and stuff? Well, and if they're illiterate as well, it's a big challenge there. So, in general, some of the other impacts of indigenous data sovereignty, you get to see, there was this case documented, some reporter found a nice shirt with indigenous patterns from the Mija region, which was being sold in Europe, I think, and some in the States as well. Sarah has some other brands with no royalties to the indigenous groups, and they weren't even aware of it. Somebody's profiting from their little patterns and stuff. So we have the challenge of first breaking the vicious circle of marginalization and poverty conditions, but indigenous data sovereignty is or will be a very interesting standpoint to work on this. So if you know anybody in Mexico who's willing to join the team, that would be great. Thank you.